This is the most ruthless man in Breaking Bad. Just because his subordinate appeared at the scene of a murder, he didn't hesitate to kill him. This action is enough to prove Gus's consistently cautious style of doing things, while also serving as a warning to establish his own threat. Even Mike, who has followed him for years, didn't expect the boss to make such a move. After venting his anger, Gus washed the blood off his face and changed into a crisp suit. For several minutes, he didn't have a single line of dialogue, yet he kept the audience watching without daring to blink.
Well? Get back to work.
It's the same murder, but Jesse's the one who got scared both times. Then, Walter and Jesse used their usual hydrofluoric acid method to dissolve the body, which left Mike amazed. Afterwards, Walter and Jesse went to a restaurant to discuss countermeasures. Jesse pretended not to care, but in reality, he was extremely panicked inside, because they have already been on Gus's boat. It is impossible to get off when they have no use for them. That is the time of their death. When Walter got home, he found his car was missing. It turned out Skyler had intentionally parked it in a neighboring street to prevent their son from seeing it. At this time, although the relationship between the couple had eased somewhat, Skyler was forced to seek out Walter to help pay Hank's high medical bills. Skyler insisted on helping Walter launder money because she didn't trust anyone else. I have to say that Skyler is also a very cautious person. To avoid arousing suspicion, Skyler decided to buy the car wash where Walter once worked part-time for money laundering. To estimate the shop's revenue, she even staked out the car wash to observe its operations. As a former accountant, Skyler quickly drew her conclusions. However, when Skyler approached Bogdan, she encountered an obstacle. Bogdan recognized her as Walter's wife and directly asked for $2 million. Skyler's estimate was only over $800,000. Seeing Bogdan still held a grudge against Walter, Skyler had to find another way. Meanwhile, Walter, to protect his own safety, had to consider killing Gus, so he bought a revolver from the black market at a high price. To prevent any mistakes in the assassination, Walter repeatedly practiced drawing the gun at home. However, when he arrived at the lab, he didn't get a chance to see Gus. With Victor dead, Gus assigned another subordinate, Tyrus, to monitor their work. Walter made an excuse to have Mike arrange a meeting with Gus, but the vigilant Mike decisively refused. Since Gus was deliberately avoiding him, Walter planned to ambush him that night. To boost his courage, Walter donned his iconic Heisenberg hat once again, but before he reached Gus's house, he received a call from Mike.
Go home, Walter.
Mike had been secretly monitoring Walter all along. To keep Walter in line, Mike arranged to meet him at a bar to test his intentions. Before Mike could speak, Walter expressed his thoughts. Walter wanted to recruit Mike to his side, believing that after Gus killed his most loyal subordinate, Victor, Mike might be next. But Walter underestimated Mike's loyalty to Gus. Mike not only refused Walter's request but also gave him a severe beating.
It could happen.
Thanks for the drink.
Having such a loyal subordinate like Mike shows Gus's character isn't bad, unless the subordinate is foolish and not as cautious as Mike. On the other side, to numb his inner anxiety, Jesse began inviting friends over to let loose. 3 people weren't enough for excitement, so Jesse spent a fortune turning his house into a nightclub. This was his usual way of coping with harsh reality. However, at this time, Andrea showed up. She discovered that Tomas's death was likely related to Jesse, because the 2 killers who murdered Tomas were hit by a car the next night, and a large sum of money appeared in her mailbox. Jesse had never contacted her since then. A woman's intuition is not to be underestimated. Jesse didn't deny it. He hoped Andrea could use the money to start a new life with her son. Their relationship thus came to an end, but no party lasts forever, as the house full of people partied until they were exhausted. Even Jesse's 2 closest friends made excuses to leave. Helpless, Jesse turned the volume to the maximum and sat alone in front of the speaker, using deafening music to drive away his inner fears. Meanwhile, Hank, severely injured, was recuperating at home. His condition was very poor, needing to do everything in bed. Marie, who always had a princess syndrome, finally took on her responsibility. After professional rehabilitation training, Hank could finally stand and walk. But in the face of Marie's concern, Hank still couldn't positively face his condition. At this time, he, like Jesse, couldn't accept the harsh reality. If Prison Break was your introduction to American TV series, then Breaking Bad will definitely redefine your understanding of American dramas. Breaking Bad consistently pushed the plot to new heights. with each season's ratings breaking historical records. Such achievements are not only the result of the director's great efforts but also the superb acting skills of the cast, who bring every character to life in an unforgettable way. Although everyone knows Walter chose the path of crime, it seems that everyone feels a certain sympathy for him. On Walter's gradual descent into darkness, we witness many human struggles and helplessness, and we also see Gus's true colors. To prevent Walter from having any more bad ideas, Gus installed 360-degree surveillance cameras in the lab, which made Walter feel an urge to curse. To test the cameras, Walter walked around the lab, but the cameras were so effective that Walter couldn't help but give them the finger. After work, Skyler found Walter to discuss the car wash acquisition, but freshly beaten by Mike, Walter was too embarrassed to see anyone. After being turned away, Skyler realizes something is wrong and pushes the door open to find Walter with a bruise on his face, which makes Skyler instantly worried. Skyler urged Walter to turn himself in, leading to a fierce argument. Seeing Skyler's resolute stance, Walter had no choice but to confess the truth. He said he had a conflict with a colleague and got into a fight at the bar. To prove to Skyler that he wasn't a coward, Walter said he didn't fight back because the opponent was older than him. I imagine if Walter had fought back, he would have been beaten even worse. Knowing the situation wasn't that serious, Skyler didn't press the issue of turning himself in. Instead, she told Walter how to reduce the swelling. Afterwards, they met with Saul to discuss the car wash acquisition, but Saul tirelessly steered them towards buying a nail salon or arcade instead, as those options would maximize Saul's profits. However, Skyler insisted on acquiring Bogdan's car wash because Bogdan was very rude to her last time. To satisfy his client's needs, Saul came up with a bunch of bad ideas, using underhanded tactics, all of which Skyler rejected. Although they were engaged in shady business, Skyler still had her own principles. They discussed for half a day without coming up with a good strategy. However, a clever woman always finds a way. While Skyler was at home washing bottles for her daughter, a perfect idea for acquiring the car wash suddenly came to her mind, and she immediately called Saul. In the next scene, Saul's henchman, QB, pretended to be an environmental officer testing the car wash's water emissions. It was obvious that the wastewater emissions were severely non-compliant, and the car wash was ordered to shut down for rectification and install a new filtration system. However, the cost of this filtration system would consume Bogdan's entire year's profit. Bogdan protested, refusing to make changes unless QB could specify which law he had violated. But QB had no knowledge of laws and regulations. Fortunately, Skyler had done her homework. She remotely controlled QB's conversation and provided the relevant legal clauses. Bogdan was left speechless. However, when Skyler got home hours later, Bogdan still hadn't called. Walter had given up on Skyler's plan, advising her to adopt Saul's suggestion, but before Walter could finish speaking, Bogdan called to say he was willing to sell the car wash to Skyler. Skyler's attitude immediately elevated. She directly lowered the price to $800,000, nearly $80,000 less than her original offer. Bogdan was infuriated once again, and their second negotiation ended in failure. Skyler was convinced that Bogdan would call back, but Walter thought otherwise. The result was clear. Skyler's emotional intelligence completely crushed Walter's.
Hello? Hello, Mr. Willinitz.
To celebrate Skyler's success, Walter splurged on an expensive bottle of wine. Skyler reminded Walter to be more discreet, as an unemployed high school teacher shouldn't afford such luxuries. In this regard, Walter was far less cautious than Skyler. On the other side, facing immense family pressure and a bedridden husband, Marie found it hard to cope, and her kleptomania resurfaced. Interestingly, the director did not directly show Marie stealing. Instead, the behavior was depicted through visual storytelling. First, Marie appeared in someone else's house, with a shot of a child riding a pig figurine in the foreground. Then, when Marie returned home, that same figurine appeared on her bedside table. These two simple shots were enough to prove Marie's theft. This visual-centric approach is the essence of film and television art and a major attraction of the show. If you don't pay attention to certain scenes, you might miss what the current plot is conveying. Addicted to stealing, Marie couldn't resist committing theft again. However, as the saying goes, often walking by the river, your shoes will eventually get wet. This time, Marie was caught by a nanny. Realizing she's been spotted, Marie tries to run away, but the nanny stops her just in time. But Marie wouldn't admit that she had stolen anything. They started to tug at each other and Marie's things fell out of her bag. Caught red-handed, Marie still stubbornly denied it.
Are in big trouble.
Half an hour later, Marie, crying in the police station, called Hank. When Hank learned that Marie's bad habit had resurfaced, he exhibited an extreme form of silent fury. Although Hank wanted to lash out, he held back and comforted his wife, telling her not to cry, then used his connections to get Marie out of trouble. Marie's stellar performance attracted a lot of negative attention, and some fans suggested that the storyline involving Marie and Skyler could be omitted. However, the show's writers were too skilled, intertwining every plotline so tightly that removing one would break the entire chain. As a result of handling Marie's theft case, Detective Tim learned that Hank was a DEA agent. Since Tim was in charge of Gail's murder case, he found a chemistry notebook at the crime scene likely related to illicit substance manufacturing. Tim specifically visited Hank, hoping to get some clues from him. This interaction played a crucial role in the subsequent development of the story. Due to recent events, Hank was in a depressed mood and said he didn't want to be involved in work anymore. However, late at night, Hank couldn't resist picking up the notebook Tim had left behind and began to read it. This marked the beginning of Hank's gradual return to action after being severely injured. Never cross a shrewd woman, or you might not even know how you met your end. To acquire Bogdan's car wash, Skyler used a simple trick and effortlessly took over Bogdan's business. Watching his career, which he has worked so hard for decades, go down the drain shows that Bogdan has offended the wrong people. However, for the unemployed Walter, he didn't have enough money to buy such a large car wash. To explain this, Skyler tossed and turned at night, racking her brain. Previously, she had lied to Marie, saying the money for Hank's medical bills came from Walter's gambling winnings. It seemed this lie had to continue. To avoid any slip-ups, Skyler did her homework, researching gambling and even dragging Walter to a Gamblers Anonymous meeting early in the morning. However, Walter had no interest in any of it. Back home, Skyler arranged to meet her sister in the evening and made sure they wouldn't mention anything about helping Hank. Then, they started playing poker, but Walter was clueless about gambling. He used the excuse that he was currently in a gambling hiatus and didn't need to show his skills. Skyler thought it made sense, so they started rehearsing the evening's conversation. Skyler's commitment to perfecting the lie was more meticulous than filming a movie. However, Walter had an indifferent attitude, thinking Skyler was being overly cautious. When Walter saw lines in the script making him say he felt deeply ashamed, he was extremely reluctant.
Why we couldn't tell anyone.
I'm terribly, terribly ashamed of my actions.
Yeah,
2 terriblies?
it's supposed to show contrition.
Yeah, well, I just wouldn't use that word. I would never say the word terribly.
In Skyler's script, Walter's character was a loser, starkly contrasting with the immense sacrifices he had made for the family. Walter didn't want his son to look down on him and had strong objections to the script, feeling like Skyler was smearing him, so he started bringing up old grievances.
Where is the I slept with my boss bullet point? I can't seem to find that anywhere.
For a fired school teacher who cooks crystal meth, I'd say you're coming out pretty much ahead.
I don't like it. I don't want Junior thinking less of me.
At least you won at gambling. I'm just the mom who wouldn't cut you any slack.
When he hears what Skyler has to say, Walter feels a little more balanced.
I'm sorry that I put you through all of this. I'm sorry.
Thus, Walter successfully revised the lines. Then Skyler, like a director, guided Walter on various actions and expressions. Walter found it very tiresome, thinking it was just a lie, not worth the effort.
Maybe lying doesn't come as easily to me as it does to you.
Skyler voiced Walter's thoughts, which was quite ironic. In the next scene, the three of them arrived at Hank's house. Watch their expressions change tense and serious before the door opens, then smiling as soon as it does. It was like actors facing the camera, signaling that a play within a play was about to begin. After a few greetings, the sisters went to prepare dinner. The three men started examining Hank's latest mineral collection. Though Hank had studied them for a long time, he still couldn't explain why the rocks were pink. Walter, on the other hand, excelled in this area. His analysis, though hard for Hank and Walter Jr. to understand, seemed very professional. To avoid awkwardness, Hank played the DVD Tim left about Gail's case. Hank watched Gail's video with amusement, but it gave Walter the creeps. Though Walter didn't kill Gail himself, he knew who the real culprit was. At the dinner table, Skyler began performing the rehearsed script. Skyler's performance was so convincing that Hank had no doubts, and even admired Walter. Everyone wanted to know how much Walter had won. Seeing Walter's unease, Skyler answered for him.
It's enough to, after taxes, of course, to buy the car wash. Maybe even pay for a couple of halfway reasonable college educations.
Walter then said what he least wanted to say.
Son, I'm terribly, terribly ashamed of my actions.
He changed his lines on the spot, not out of shame for his artistic endeavors, but because he felt guilty for ordering Jesse to kill Gale to save himself. Walter excused himself to the bathroom but actually went to Hank's room to check for any evidence against him. Before he could look, Hank called him out, wanting help understanding Gale's chemistry notebook. Walter seized the opportunity to check for any incriminating evidence. Hank believed that Gale was Heisenberg, the man he had been chasing. However, he was puzzled by the notebook's opening lines.
Right here at the top says, to WW, my star, my perfect silence. WW, Willy Wonka, Woodrow Wilson, Walter White.
You got me.
If this isn't a joke, I think this episode could have been the series finale, but Hank would never truly suspect his brother-in-law. Luckily, Walter was quick-witted. He saw a poem by Walt Whitman in the notebook, explaining the initials WW.
When I heard the learned astronomer,
Learned. And from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars. It's a poem by Walt Whitman. Your WW.
you frickin' brainiac. You frickin' brainiac.
Though Walter was inwardly panicking, he managed to control his fear.
So, you think this Gale person is your Heisenberg?
Yeah, I think so. God, I wanted to get this guy.
It looks like you did.
Nah, I mean, me personally, I wanted to be the one to slap the handcuffs on him, that kind of.
Hank's words set the stage for future plot developments. Walter tentatively asked about the killer, and Hank said the police were comparing fingerprints and had an eyewitness. The police would eventually find the shooter. Walter, terrified, rushed to find Jesse. By then, Jesse's house had become a refuge for the homeless. Still haunted by killing Gale, Jesse needed this chaotic environment to distract himself. To ensure their safety, Walter asked Jesse to recall the details of Gale's murder, reopening Jesse's unhealed wounds. In his anguish, Jesse couldn't take it anymore and paid someone to kick Walter out. Desperate, Walter turned to Saul for help. Knowing only he understood the potential dangers, Saul suggested an ultimate solution, making Walter disappear. He had the resources. As long as Walter had the money, though Walter didn't take this option, it foreshadowed future events. The man returned home only to find his house turned into a refuge for vagrants. Not only did he not drive them away, but he also enjoyed their presence. Seeing the homeless people in pity, he threw his money into the air. However, his erratic behavior stemmed from being forced to kill an innocent man. Using this chaos to distract himself, worried that the vagrants would leave, he gave them money to buy food before going to work. Seeing Jesse's actions, the tattooed guy began to harbor malicious intentions. When Jesse got home from work, he brought some artwork to share with them and then took a girl upstairs to play video games. As soon as he got upstairs, Jesse realized his money was stolen, but he didn't care and continued to play games with the girl. Jesse seemed utterly lost in despair. The next morning, still half asleep, Jesse was yanked out of bed by Mike. Jesse came downstairs to find everyone had been thrown out by Mike, with the thief beaten and his money recovered. Since Jesse killed Gale, they had been monitoring him closely. Getting his money back didn't cheer Jesse up. Instead, he seemed more sober than ever. Mike, frustrated, reported the situation to his boss. Gus.
It's Pinkman. He's become increasingly incautious. He's a risk, a liability. I know he and Walter come as a team and that Walter won't like it. But something's got to be done.
The next day, Walter worked half a day alone without seeing Jesse. He called Jesse, but there was no answer. So Walter went to Jesse's house but got no response when knocking. Fortunately, a window was unlocked. Walter climbed in but found the house empty, with Jesse's phone left behind. Walter concluded that Gus had either taken Jesse or had him killed, but without access to Gus, he could only vent his anger at the cameras.
Where is he?
Meanwhile, Jesse was being taken on an unknown route by Mike. Walter, unable to concentrate on work, decided to confront Gus and plan to take him down, even preparing his last words.
Hi, you've reached the White family. Please leave a message.
Hey, it's me.
I just wanted to say that I was thinking about you and the kids, and I love you.
He sped to Gus's restaurant. Seeing Gus's car, Walter took the gun he bought from the black market and headed straight for the restaurant, but the staff said the boss wasn't there. Walter didn't believe it, claiming he wouldn't leave until he saw Gus. Seeing cameras everywhere, Walter felt constantly monitored. Soon, Mike called, saying Jesse was with him and told Walter to return to the lab. Walter didn't believe him and demanded to speak with Jesse, but Jesse had no idea what Mike was taking him to do. Before Walter could finish, Mike hung up. Frustrated, Walter stormed into Gus's office. To his surprise, Gus wasn't there. Meanwhile, Jesse was taken to a desolate area. At this moment, Jesse finally began to feel scared because it was clear that Mike had brought him to an isolated place to eliminate him. Jesse clutched his keys, ready to defend himself, but Mike ignored him, walking off with a shovel. Was Mike going to bury him alive? Mike found a hole covered with boards and retrieved a bag full of cash. Mike had brought Jesse along to help retrieve hidden money from transactions, with 6 more locations to visit that day. The plot is directly reversed here. Just when everyone thought Jesse was about to be killed, he miraculously escaped death again. However, what Gus truly has planned will only be revealed in the end. Jesse realized he was just there to stand guard for Mike and requested a gun for protection, which Mike denied. Bored, Jesse chattered nonstop in the car. Mike, fed up, pulled over and yelled at him.
You are not the guy. You're not capable of being the guy. I had a guy, but now I don't. You are not the guy.
Then what the hell am I doing here?
I don't know. I just do what I'm told. And now you're gonna do what you're told, which is to sit here, shut up, and stay in the car till we finish our pickups. You got it?
Meanwhile, Walter was left to work alone. Needing a break, he remembered the car wash acquisition and rushed home to sign the contract with their lawyer. Walter and Skyler were now completely in the same boat. To celebrate this significant moment, they decided to raise a toast. At that moment, Skyler noticed a voicemail notification and quickly listened.
It's me. I just wanted to say that I was thinking about you and the kids, and I love you.
It was Walter's emotional farewell message before his confrontation with Gus. Hearing his heartfelt words, they seemed to reconnect with their old feelings. Skyler then suggested Walter move back in, making it easier to explain their strong relationship and joint ownership of the car wash. Walter then rushes back to work, but he doesn't know how to drive a forklift and gets angry at the camera again.
Hey! This is a two-man job. I can't do it alone. I'm done. That's it. Finished. Nothing else happens until I get my partner back.
After a break, Walter heard someone enter, thinking it was Jesse, but it was Gus's henchman, Tyrus. Walter insisted Jesse return to help him, but at this point, he had no say in the matter, and Jesse and Mike made it to the last stop. While Jesse was keeping watch out of boredom, he suddenly saw a guy with a gun approaching. He doesn't care, he just backs up his car and crashes into the guy, then lures him out of the way, leaving Mike alone and confused in the wind. Just as Mike was about to call for help, Jesse returned in time and explained the situation to Mike. Mike appreciated his actions and even allowed him to smoke in the car. The next day, when Walter arrived at work, he saw Jesse was back and anxiously asked him what he had been doing the day before. Jesse describes the whole thing and is proud of his accomplishment. Jesse grew impatient with Walter's questioning and claimed he now had 2 jobs. He told Walter to change clothes and get to work. However, Jesse didn't realize he was gradually falling into Gus's trap. Unlike Walter, Gus understood human weaknesses better. He knows that Jesse is a man who craves approval. So Gus deliberately set up this play to get Jesse to get his approval. With a sense of accomplishment, Jesse wouldn't be as obedient to Walter. As expected, this would distance them, which was exactly what Gus wanted. In the evening, the 2 families gathered together. Walter, still frustrated, couldn't figure out Gus's game. Depressed, Walter began to drown his sorrows in alcohol. As they talked, Hank brought up Gail's case. Hank praised Gail as a genius in chemistry but lamented that his talent was misused, leading to his death. Hearing this, the drunken Walter became arrogant.
Not to tell you your business, but I'm not sure I agree.
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, you showed me that notebook, and from what I saw, and this is just my humble opinion, from what I saw on those papers, genius? I mean, There was no reasoning, no deductions in those pages. So to my eye, all this brilliance looks like nothing more than just simple rote copying. Probably of someone else's work. Believe me, I have been around enough students to know. This genius of yours, maybe he's still out there.
This was practically digging his own grave. Walter's words made Skyler break out in a cold sweat. It became clear that, like Jesse, Walter also desperately needed recognition, which was their inherent weakness. This rekindled Hank's interest in Gail's case, despite his earlier intention to let it go. According to the records, Gail was a vegetarian, but what puzzled Hank was when vegetarians started liking fried chicken. This is the kind of robbery you've never seen before. The robbers didn't fire a single bullet yet easily took down 2 armed guards. Just moments ago, the 2 guards heard the truck being intercepted, followed by the sound of the driver being shot in the head. They immediately went on alert, but they had no idea about the robbers' ruthless methods. The robbers inserted one end of a hose into the truck's air intake and connected the other end to the exhaust pipe. Exhaust fumes quickly filled the truck's cabin. Then, they locked the doors and placed a heavy brick on the gas pedal. The man also took the driver's lunchbox. The 2 guards inside panicked, desperately banging on the doors to no avail. The robbers ate and watched them suffocate. A few minutes later, they found the buckets of fried chicken batter with the new labels and took them. Inside those buckets were Gus's contraband, but Gus wasn't going to stand by while this happened, so he arranged for Mike to take Jesse to investigate. Following Mike's leads, they found out that the junkies in a particular house had the stolen goods but hadn't bought them directly from Gus's operation. Figuring out where the junkies got the goods would lead them to the robbers. Mike discovered that these people liked to carry weapons and didn't play by the rules. The safest approach was to observe them discreetly. However, Jesse grew impatient and decided to pose as a buyer to gather information, but they didn't deal with strangers, so Jesse was turned away. Back in the car, Jesse came up with another idea. Unlike Mike, he understood the mind of a junkie. Jesse took a shovel from the trunk and started digging a hole near their house, quickly piquing the junkie's curiosity. Because junkies often repeat the same actions, Jesse successfully passed the digging task to one of them. This allowed Jesse to sneak into their house. Even though he claimed to be friends with the guy digging outside, the junkies inside still pointed a gun at him. Mike, hearing the commotion, came to Jesse's aid. Taking advantage of the man's distraction, Jesse knocked him out. Mike saw that the note written on the lid of the stolen fried chicken batter bucket was left by the Mexican cartel. They wanted to confront Gus. In the 3rd season, Gus had orchestrated the elimination of their key personnel and secured a talent like Walter, creating a perfect self-sustaining operation. Gus is a huge threat to the Mexican drug cartel. The robbery at the beginning of the video was a warning to Gus. Earlier, at the gathering, a slightly inebriated Walter dug his own grave in front of Hank. His words kept Skyler up all night. Skyler suspected that the deceased Gail was Walter's colleague. Combining this with Walter's recent injuries and his heartfelt voicemail, Skyler realized it wasn't a declaration of love but more like a final farewell. Skyler concluded that Walter was in danger and insisted he go to the police. Compared to making money, she was more concerned about Walter's safety. Skyler's nagging made Walter impatient. To prove his capability, Walter said something he would regret.
Who are you talking to right now? Who is it you think you see? Do you know how much I make a year? I mean, even if I told you, you wouldn't believe it. Do you know what would happen if I suddenly decided to stop going into work? I am not in danger, Skyler. I am the danger. A guy opens his door and gets shot and you think that of me? No. I am the one who knocks.
Skyler was frightened by this new side of Walter, completely unlike the man she once knew. After the outburst, Walter doesn't realize the consequences of his words, and when he gets out of the shower he realizes that his wife has left the house with their daughter. That evening, Walter went to the car wash for the handover. Bogdan never imagined that his car wash would one day be bought by a former employee. Bogdan kept taunting Walter to vent his own frustration. Unaware of what Walter had been through recently, Walter didn't argue with Bogdan's sarcasm. When Bogdan tried to take the first dollar he earned, Walter firmly refused.
As is.
The next morning, Skyler hadn't returned, leaving Walter and Walter Jr. to have a lonely breakfast together. Walter Jr. noticed the tension between his parents and speculated that his mother was angry at Walter for gambling. Walter Jr. felt sorry for his father and was upset with his mother's behavior. Walter didn't know how to explain and told Walter Jr. not to jump to conclusions, insisting it was all his fault, not his mother's. On the way to school, since Walter Jr. had recently gotten his driver's license and always wanted his own car, Walter decided to fulfill his wish. Walter bought his son his favorite Dodge Challenger, and Walter Jr. idolized him even more. If Walter Jr. knew where the money came from, would he still accept the car? Walter arrived at work and saw Jesse at the door. He pulled Jesse aside to a place without cameras to ask what he had been doing with Mike. Jesse said he was just acting as a bodyguard. Walter found this very puzzling. Gus had many subordinates, so why choose Jesse, who didn't seem fit for the role? Walter guessed it was all part of Gus's trap, but Jesse, having gained Gus's approval, wouldn't listen to Walter.
They can't outright kill me, but they don't want me getting high. I see this thing probably started as Gus getting Mike to babysit me. But you know what? I saved Mike from getting robbed. Even killed, maybe. So maybe I'm not such a loser after all.
Poor Walter had spent so long with Jesse and never gained his trust, while Gus won him over with a small trick. As soon as they got to the lab, Jesse was assigned to an outside task.
Gotta go. What, am I supposed to clean all this on my own?
Helpless, Walter had to get 3 female workers from the laundromat to clean the lab. Seeing it was a restricted area, they initially refused, but money talked. Walter smugly drank his coffee and looked at the camera. However, after the women finished cleaning, they were fired. Walter pleaded for them, but Tyrus ignored him. That night, Mike reported to Gus about the day's work. He discovered that the car robbery was carried out by the Mexican cartel. Mike wanted to ask Gus for a few enforcers so he could drive the cartel members back to their home turf. Gus didn't want to start a war and instead asked Mike to arrange a meeting with them. He also inquired about Jesse's performance.
How did he do today?
I hear you can handle yourself.
I guess. Why me?
I like to think I see things in people.
Meanwhile, frightened by Walter, Skyler drove to the Four Corners Monument. She wanted to use a coin toss to decide whether to stay or leave. However, both times the coin flips told her to leave the place. Skyler looks at her newborn daughter and decides to stay. Back home, Skyler saw the Dodge at the door and knew Walter had messed up again. While their son was out for a drive, Walter apologized for his harsh words and assured her that he and the family were safe. He said everything he did was for the family. Skyler snapped back immediately. Was buying that Dodge for the family? It will only expose our lies. If you really care about this family, return the car tomorrow.
I just worry that he'll blame you for this.
Oh, he will. Once again, he'll blame his mother for taking away what his loving father has given him, so thanks for that. But you know what, Walt? Someone has to protect this family from the man who protects this family.
Which one of them do you think did the right thing? A man, seeking a thrill, drove his newly purchased Dodge into a parking lot and started drifting wildly. However, he wasn't a professional driver and within minutes, he managed to drive the car into a ditch. The world of the wealthy is always unpredictable. He took out the purchase contract, rolled it up, and stuffed it directly into the fuel tank, then used a lighter to set it on fire. Finally, he sat on the ground with a satisfied look on his face. In just a few minutes, Walter lost $500,000, but at this moment, he didn't care about the money. He was more concerned about when Gus would make a move against him. To ensure his own survival, Walter had to strike against Gus first. Walter asked Saul to introduce some hitmen to him, but unfortunately, the hitmen Saul knew were also known to Mike. Walter planned to do it himself but found it difficult to get close to Gus. Saul suggested he talk to Jesse, since he knew Jesse had recently met Gus. Looks like Saul and Jesse have a better relationship than he does. Jesse detailed his recent encounter with Gus to Walter, learning that Gus planned to heavily utilize Jesse. Walter urgently reminded him, "Have you forgotten that just a month ago he wanted to kill us? And the kid they used and got killed?" Jesse understood Walter's point and impatiently said he would kill Gus if given the chance. So, Walter synthesized ricin in a camera blind spot at work. This was the poison they had previously planned to use on Tuco. Walter gave it to Jesse, who hid it in a cigarette, ready to act at any moment. Soon, the opportunity arose. Gus arranged a meeting with the Mexican businessman, and Jesse was called by Mike to help prepare coffee. It was the perfect time to do it. Just as Jesse was about to take out the hidden ricin, Mike suddenly called him from behind and handed Jesse a gun for protection, instructing him to be very cautious. It was clear that Mike now considered Jesse one of his own. Very soon, the Mexican businessmen arrived by car, and the ones who got out were the same robbers from the beginning of the previous episode, but they are just employees of the Mexican drug cartel, which obviously does not take Gus seriously. Gus proposed a one-time payment of $55 million to resolve the conflict between them, but this offer didn't meet the other party's expectations, and the negotiation ended unpleasantly, setting the stage for a future conflict. At this moment, Jesse had the perfect opportunity to kill Gus, but he hesitated. Days later, Walter seized an opportunity to ask Jesse if he had acted against Gus, and Jesse lied, saying he hadn't seen Gus. Meanwhile, Walter's actions led Hank to revisit Gail's case. Hank discovers that Gail, who has always been a vegetarian, has a wrapper from a fried chicken restaurant with a mysterious string of numbers on it. Hank asked Walter Jr., who had just learned to drive, to take him to the chicken restaurant to investigate the clues. Hank's dedication was commendable. Even using crutches didn't stop him from investigating. Gus enthusiastically served them and even refilled Hank's drink, allowing Hank to easily collect Gus's fingerprints. After days of investigation, Hank discovered some important clues and went to the DEA to report to George. Hank linked Gail's case to his pursuit of Heisenberg. The numbers on the fried chicken paper were a part number, used in a high-efficiency air filtration system. Such a small part cost over $300,000, typically used in pharmaceutical labs. Since it was found at Gail's place, it was likely used in their super lab for drug production. Hank also found out that the manufacturer of the filtration system was a large multinational company named Madrigal Electromotive. He called their customer service to inquire about the part, and found out it was received by Gail, but there was no record of who paid for it. After learning about Hank's identity, the company involved their legal team, cutting off the lead. Hank then investigated the multinational company. Their headquarters were in Germany, and they were involved in many industries, including investing in chain restaurants in the US, like Gus's chicken restaurant. All these clues led Hank to guess that Gail's financier was probably Gus, but George thought Hank's speculation was too far-fetched. Hank anticipated their concerns and produced fingerprints from Gail's crime scene, matching them with Gus's. Faced with this solid evidence, Gus was summoned to the police station for questioning the next day. A detail in this scene is worth noting. On the police station's board, there was a picture of the suspect Victor. Victor had been seen at Gail's murder scene, so Gus eliminated this potential threat. This again demonstrated Gus's cautious and ruthless approach, facing the joint investigation by the DEA and the police. Gus hid his fear and responded to their questions with wit. Gus claimed he had provided Gail with a scholarship during his university days and hadn't seen him in a long time. Recently, Gail invited Gus over to his house with the intention of borrowing money, but Gus didn't agree. Soon after, Gail was murdered. Gus also provided an alibi for the time of the murder. Seeing no fruitful results, Hank questioned Gus about his background. Hank had done in-depth research on Gus's personal history. Gus was born in Chile and later immigrated to the US, but there were no records from before his immigration. Gus explained that it was likely due to local government negligence causing a loss of records and encouraged Hank to continue investigating. One had to admire Gus's composure in such situations. The consequences of a person's hubris can be terrifying. Walter successfully reminded Hank that the deceased Gail was not the Heisenberg he was looking for. After a thorough investigation, Hank pointed the finger at the fast food restaurant owner, Gus, but due to insufficient evidence, the always discreet Gus managed to evade suspicion. However, Hank did not give up easily and decided to continue investigating Gus. Since Hank's gunshot wound had not fully healed, he used the pretext of attending a mineral exhibit to get Walter to take him out. It wasn't until they arrived at the fried chicken restaurant that Hank revealed his true purpose. At this point, Walter was a bit flustered. He never expected Hank to track things back to Gus. Hank's words made Walter's gut turn blue.
Remember Gail Beneke? That's the sad sack from the karaoke videotape?
Yeah.
And you said that he didn't strike you as being the boss man type, that probably there was a much bigger guy out there, right?
Hank, that was just speculation.
Doesn't matter. It made me keep at it. And guess what I find? Chicken Man's fingerprints at Beneker's murder scene.
He wished he could find a place to slap himself hard. he urgently asked Hank about the results, as it was his instinctive reaction. To avoid showing any connection with Gus, Walter desperately concealed his inner fear. Hank didn't just call Walter to act as his driver, he also wanted Walter to help him install a tracking device on Gus's car. At that moment, Mike parked his car next to them, putting Walter in a difficult position. Walter initially wanted to refuse with an excuse but couldn't resist Hank's persistent pleading. Reluctantly, Walter pretended to squat down. However, instead of installing the tracker, Walter went into the store to confess to Gus.
See, I didn't do it. Do it.
With Gus's permission, Walter came back out and finally installed the tracker. Hank was baffled. Does installing a tracker really require 2 attempts? He wondered. Walter got back in the car and explained he was just checking if it was securely installed. Hank's maneuver left Walter in a state of panic. He hurried to the lab's camera and explained to Gus that he did not intentionally bring Hank there to investigate. He also confessed that Hank had no concrete evidence. Walter promised that as long as Gus ensured Hank's safety, Hank wouldn't find any clues. Immediately after, Walter went to Jesse's house and questioned him about why he hadn't acted against Gus yet. At this moment, Walter desperately needed Gus dead. He coached Jesse on how to make an excuse to meet with Gus, but Jesse wasn't taking it seriously. Recently, Gus's recognition and heavy use of Jesse made him reluctant to act. This also reflected Jesse's indecisive nature. While Jesse was in the bathroom, Walter overheard Jesse's phone ringing. He quickly took it out to check and saw a message, proving Jesse had indeed met with Gus recently. Facing Jesse's lies, Walter realized he couldn't rely on him. Meanwhile, Mike was also investigating Hank. At this moment, Hank was fighting alone. Even the tracker he used was installed illegally. Mike indicated that as long as they were cautious, Hank wouldn't catch anything. Compared to dealing with Hank, the Mexican cartel was a bigger headache. If they were discovered by Hank during the conflict, it would be extremely troublesome. With a capable person like Mike, Gus was quite reassured. Gus also began to advance his plan. He removed Hank's tracker from his car and then went to the nursing home to visit Tio. On the surface, Gus was visiting Tio, but in reality, he was signaling his revenge. Reflecting on Gus's early experiences, a young and inexperienced Gus, along with his friend Max, went to negotiate business with the cartel group. At that time, Tio was still in his prime, exuding arrogance and making the young Gus unable to look him in the eye. Although Gus and Max's product was a novelty back then, it posed a potential threat to the cartel group. Moreover, expanding their market on the cartel's turf was seen as a challenge to the cartel's dominance. Gus and Max realized something was wrong and hurriedly tried to explain, but it was too late. With a gunshot, Max fell dead by the poolside. The shooter was the fierce Tio. A devastated Gus tried to fight Tio but was restrained and pinned down by the pool. From that moment, a seed of hatred was deeply planted in Gus's heart. However, it's not too late for a gentleman to take revenge. After years of operations, Gus finally secured his own position and gained enough strength to confront them. And now, Tio was paying the price for his actions in his youth. A few days later, Walter helped Hank retrieve the tracker from Gus's car. Hank returned home and investigated, finding that Gus's routine was strictly between 2 points, never deviating, which made Hank even more suspicious. When Walter was leaving, he saw that Gus's men had been spying on Hank, so he didn't say a word and called the police.
Yes, hi. I live on the 4900 block of Doswell Place, and I want to report a very suspicious man who's lurking in my neighborhood. He's sitting in a blue sedan, and he's been staring at a particular house for a very long time. Thank you. Thank you so much. If you would, I would appreciate it.
When it came to protecting his family, Walter would not hesitate. Early the next morning, Walter was woken up by a call from Hank, who claimed to have located Gus's supply base just outside the city. Upon hearing this, Walter was instantly wide awake. Hank wanted Walter to accompany him again, but Walter quickly feigned illness and refused. Promising to take Hank when he felt better, Walter then contacted Mike and informed him of Hank's plan to prevent Hank from finding incriminating evidence. Upon hearing this, Mike hurriedly took Jesse to handle the situation. Meanwhile, due to Walter's massive earnings, Skyler found that a single car wash couldn't launder all the money. Skyler had no choice but to hide the extra money in sealed bags, but the amount was so large that the clothes rod couldn't support its weight. With no other choice, Skyler hid the money in the floorboards of the house. Thanks to Skyler's meticulous calculations, their car wash was soon to be profitable. Skyler shared this good news with Walter and suggested he could consider retiring, but what Skyler didn't know was that Walter could no longer make a clean getaway. The next day, while Jesse and others were moving things at Gus's farm, a colleague ahead of them was suddenly shot in the head by a sniper. Jesse was frozen in place, terrified by the horrifying scene. Unbeknownst to him, the sniper had already aimed at him. At the critical moment, Mike pulled him away, saving his life. They hid behind cover, not daring to make a move. Hearing the commotion, Gus exuded a powerful aura and boldly walked toward the sniper's direction. The sniper was the same representative sent by the cartel group to negotiate with Gus earlier. He didn't dare to actually kill Gus because the cartel still relied on Gus's distribution network in the US. They just wanted to exert some pressure on him. Clever as ever, Gus understood their intent, which is why he dared to make such a bold move. When a corpse was pushed in, Walter curiously asked what was going on, thinking Gus had killed another subordinate. Mike, standing nearby, told him to shut up.
I don't want you talking to me or Jesse. Just get the barrel. And if you ever plan on calling the cops on one of my guys again, you go ahead and get 2 barrels.
To resolve the conflict with the cartel group once and for all, Gus invited Jesse to his home. Jesse would play a crucial role in this plan. Seeing a pot of soup nearby, Jesse took out the cigarette containing the ricin, but in the end, he didn't use it. Gus asked Jesse if he could leave Walter and work independently, which made Jesse think Gus was planning to kill Walter.
Why? You asking me if I can cook, Mr. White's the loser you were about to waste and dump in the desert a month ago? Then get me to keep for you after you kill Mr. White. You kill Mr. White, you're gonna have to kill me too.
That is not what I asked you. And I need your help. I need you to help prevent an all-out war. Now, if you would, answer the question.
Clearly, Jesse misunderstood Gus's intentions. The next day, Walter left work early before finishing his tasks because he needed to secretly retrieve the tracker he had placed on Jesse's car. He learned that from Hank. Jesse was supposed to be sent by Gus to the cartel group to teach, but lacking confidence in his own skills, he planned to have Walter tutor him. Jesse explained to Walter the tension between Gus and the cartel group, stressing that if he failed, Gus would not spare him. Jesse urged Walter to start tutoring him as soon as possible, but Walter had no response. Still fixated on why Jesse had lied to him, Walter questioned Jesse if he had seen Gus. Jesse lied, claiming he hadn't seen him. Walter forcefully took out the cigarette containing the ricin and asked Jesse, "Are you sure you weren't at Gus's house last night?" Seeing he couldn't hide it anymore, Jesse admitted he didn't find an opportunity. Walter questioned, "You mean you had no chance in over 2 hours?" Jesse then realized how Walter knew so much about his actions. Walter, no longer hiding, showed Jesse the tracker.
7:10 to 9:28 p.m. 2 hours and 18 minutes. But you had no intentions, did you? Not the slightest intention.
Everything that I have done for you.
Oh!
You put a bug on my core?
I'm sorry, after everything you've done for me, what you've done for me, you killed me is what you've done. You've signed my death warrant. And now you want advice? All right, I'll give you advice. Go to Mexico and screw up like I know you will, and wind up in a barrel somewhere.
They're both pissed off to the max, and Walter and Jesse are on the verge of a huge fight. It's clear that the older Walter doesn't have the upper hand at all, and at the end Jesse politely asks Walter,
"Can you walk?" Get the out of here and never come back.
Skyler was diligently working when her former boss came to visit, catching her completely off guard. She thought Ted still wanted to pester her. Since she had reconciled with Walter, she decisively rejected Ted. However, she couldn't withstand Ted's persistent insistence, so they retreated to a private room. It turned out that Walter had misunderstood the situation. Ted's company was facing financial trouble due to tax evasion, and he was looking at criminal charges. In addition to paying hefty fines, he was facing 5 years in prison. Ted's purpose for this visit was to ask Skyler, with her accounting expertise, to help him cook the books. Since Skyler was his former accountant, many financial documents bore her signature. If Ted couldn't pay the fines on time, everyone involved would be audited. Seeing Skyler's dilemma, Ted left disappointed. Skyler couldn't risk an audit herself, as she was also cooking the books for her car wash. The consequences of an audit would be catastrophic. The next day, Skyler cooperated with Ted, staging a performance in front of the auditor. She played the role of a buxom, brainless former employee without an accounting license, behaving very unprofessionally. When the auditor asked how she was hired, Skyler's antics made it clear she got the job through connections. Her performance gave Ted some breathing room. If he paid the missing taxes in time, he could avoid prison, but Ted was now broke, with no means to come up with the over $600,000 needed. Skyler, being clever, suggested he liquidate assets, such as using his house as collateral for a loan or selling his luxury car. Ted revealed that his house was already repossessed and his luxury car auctioned off. He was at rock bottom, driving away in a recently bought used car, afraid of being implicated. Skyler lost sleep all night, and suddenly a bold idea flashed through her mind. So she got up and went to the place where she had hidden the money. She planned to use this money to solve Ted's problem and protect herself from exposure. Considering Walter's current earning speed, she figured they could quickly fill the financial gap. Not wanting Ted to know she was behind the help, she enlisted lawyer Saul to handle the matter. Saul, though skeptical, followed Skyler's instructions as he had no say in the matter. Saul called Ted to his office and gave him some bad news. Ted's distant aunt had passed away, and since she had no children, Ted was the heir to her estate, which amounted to over $600,000. This news, far from bad, was a godsend for Ted. Saul's intuition proved right. After observing Ted, Saul noticed that instead of paying the fines promptly, Ted used the money to buy another luxury car. Old habits die hard. Skyler, infuriated, stormed into Ted's office to confront him. Ted, still looking thrilled about his good fortune, was eager to get his company back on track, using the new car as an excuse for impressing clients. Skyler hinted that Ted should use the money to pay his fines first, but Ted had no intention of doing so and resented Skyler's meddling, giving her a perfunctory agreement. Skyler, not one to be easily fooled, demanded a definite answer from Ted. Annoyed, Ted snapped, "Just because we had a fling doesn't mean you can boss me around. This isn't your business." Ted then stood up and ordered her to leave. Speechless, Skyler got up to leave but couldn't resist revealing that she was the aunt, letting Ted know who had actually helped him.
Do you think you got that $600,000, Ted? Great Aunt Birgit.
That was you?
She had sacrificed so much only to be unappreciated. The next day, Skyler received a voicemail from Ted. Ted said he couldn't accept Skyler's help and suggested they sit down and talk if possible. Hearing this, Skyler was furious and went straight to Ted's house. Notice a hint here. Ted accidentally tripped over the carpet. You'll understand why the shot is important later. Ted returned the money Skyler gave him, using the excuse that he felt it was inappropriate to repay his debts with Walter's gambling winnings. Skyler shot back immediately.
Ted, the whole reason we're in this mess is because you had me cooking your books. So, when did wrong suddenly become a problem for you?
Now hold on, that was a one-time measure I took in an honest attempt to protect my employees and save my dad's company. And it might have been a mistake, but that's no reason to go out and make another.
No, Ted, this is the big mistake right here. You owe the federal government $617,000. If you do not pay them, they will come after you, and then they will come after me. And if they audit my business, find out that Walt and I paid for it with close to $1 million in untaxed gambling winnings, we will go to prison where you will already be. Do you understand?
I understand you're upset, but I think you're overstating things too. No one's going to prison.
Oh my God, how are you not following me here?
Ted then started playing dumb. He knew that paying off the taxes wouldn't change his situation, so he figured if Skyler was so generous, she could give him more help. After all, he now knew about their money laundering operation through the car wash. Though Ted appeared to be returning the money out of goodwill, his little scheme was too obvious for the sharp Skyler. Skyler, enraged, tore up the check and demanded Ted write a new one payable to the IRS, but Ted refused to comply. Skyler, fuming, called Saul for help, asking him to find a way to make Ted pay his back taxes. After Saul's investigation, Ted doesn't have a legally purchased gun. nor does he have an emergency security system in his house. It seemed Saul would have to use some unlawful methods. Skyler specifically instructed Saul not to make a big scene, just to get Ted to write the check to the IRS. Saul reassured her, promising to send his best men to handle the situation. The scene shifts to Saul's men arriving at Ted's house. Without permission, they barged right in.
You happy?
Reasonably.
What would make you unhappy?
This not doing what he's told.
And if you would have become unhappy, Mr. Beneke wouldn't care for that?
I'm gonna say no.
Well, there you have it. Let's go find your checkbook. Ready? Here we go.
They then forcibly made Ted write the check. At first, Ted pretended he didn't have enough money, but QB didn't believe him and handed him the check to fill out with the exact amount to be sent to the IRS. Realizing that the men were sent by Skyler, Ted tried to use the phone as an excuse to call the police, but faced with Huel, he had no chance and had to obey.
Huel's gonna hang here with you. I'm gonna make sure I get this down to UPS before 5 o'clock. Way back, I'm gonna grab some sandwiches. 3 of us can hang out, play cards or watch TV or whatever for the next couple of days until the check clears.
Terrified, Ted tried to flee, but he tripped over the carpet and slammed his head against the cabinet, returning to when Ted opened the door for Skyler. Ignoring this problem would eventually lead to a painful consequence. Doesn't this mirror Ted's current predicament? QB and Huel exchanged glances and shook their heads in resignation. Skyler didn't want a mess, but a mess was made. Saul's supposedly reliable men hadn't handled things well. Ted's end was grim, realizing how formidable Skyler was. He didn't dare provoke her again. Skyler visited Ted in the hospital, and Ted didn't dare play dumb anymore. Before Skyler could speak, Ted swore he never told anyone about Skyler laundering money for Walter and promised to keep quiet in the future. Ted, pleading for mercy, mentioned he had 2 kids and begged Skyler to let him go. Thus, Ted's character officially exited the scene. This was Gus's most explosive moment of acting, facing a sniper from hundreds of meters away. He bravely spread his arms without fear, using his formidable presence to force the sniper to retreat. Gus knew this was the Mexican cartel applying pressure and not intending to kill him. Afterward, Gus received a call from them and agreed to their demands. Their demand was to take his chemist. However, Gus wouldn't easily hand over his chemist, especially after they brutally murdered his friend Max. Swallowing his pride, Gus decided to strike back. First, he thoroughly prepared Jesse and then took him and Mike to Mexico. Seeing Jesse's worried expression, Gus didn't forget to encourage him, to prevent them from seeing the surroundings. They were blindfolded the entire journey until they arrived at a large factory, where their blindfolds were finally removed. There were highly educated chemistry professionals, and armed guards patrolled upstairs. However, the cartel boss wasn't present. He first wanted to test the chemist Gus brought. Benicio, noticing Jesse didn't look professional, showed a disdainful expression. They asked Jesse to start his performance. After a round, Jesse realized there was no phenylacetic acid. Benicio said it was synthesized on-site and that any sophomore could make it. This stumped Jesse, who hadn't graduated high school. Jesse explained to Gus that they usually used a finished product stored in a sealed container, and he really couldn't make that from scratch. Benicio, sensing their flaw, began to give Gus a hard time. Although Jesse couldn't understand the language, he could feel the hostile attitude.
Tell this if he wants to learn how to make, he's got to do it my way, the right way.
I speak English.
So you understand what means. Now go get me my I mean, this place is disgusting. All right, we're gonna scour every vat, every tank, every surface. And then we're gonna clean up every possible source of contamination. And only then, we
Who do you think you are?
I'm the guy your boss brought here to show you how it's done. And if this is how you no wonder. You're lucky he hasn't fired your ass. Now, if you don't want that to happen, I suggest you stop whining like a little and do what I say.
At a critical moment, Jesse didn't disappoint, impressing Gus. Jesse finally produced contraband with a purity of 96.2%. Jesse passed their test and they earned a chance to meet the cartel boss. Don noticed the scene before Don's appearance, which seems ordinary but is significant. Gus stood by the pool, the very spot where Max was killed years ago. Gus discreetly took 2 pills. Then Don appeared with his entourage. Seeing his enemy, Gus was filled with rage but had to suppress it. Gus pretended to hand Jesse over and brought a gift for Don, claiming it symbolized their renewed friendship. When Don opened it, he found a bottle of world-class blue sapphire tequila, and he was delighted, deciding to drink it with Gus. While pouring the drinks, Don warned his men that if they spilled a single drop, they should watch their heads. This also highlights the preciousness of the bottle, and on a deeper level reflects the importance that Gus attaches to this operation. Don even courteously handed a glass to his new employee, Jesse. Gus mentioned that Jesse was an alcoholic and drinking would hinder his work. Hearing this, Don quickly took the glass back from Jesse. Everyone raised their glasses to celebrate, and Gus dutifully drank first, actually to prove the drink wasn't poisoned. Then, all the important personnel drank. Don saw through Gus's intentions and advised him not to get emotional, saying, "In my territory, you follow my rules." But Gus didn't pay any attention to Don, and then he excused himself to go to the bathroom, and Don thoughtfully arranged for a bodyguard to accompany him. In the restroom, Gus turned on the faucet to cover any noise, then neatly folded his jacket. This gentlemanly act was Gus's signature move. He placed a towel on the floor, knelt in front of the toilet, and stuck his fingers down his throat to induce vomiting. Meanwhile, Don's cigar dropped uncontrollably from his hand, and everyone who had drunk the tequila began to collapse one by one. Don realized too late that the drink was poisoned. The non-drinkers tried to help, but Mike grabbed his neck from behind. Jesse was so scared, he didn't know what to do. Gus had vomited most of the tequila and, combined with the preemptive medication, was not in immediate danger. The bodyguard at the restroom door was already dead. When Gus emerged, everyone else was on the floor, leaving only the dying Don. Seeing Gus's expression, which could kill a person in an instant, the once dominant leader of the cartel group has fallen. Mike reminded the dazed Jesse to find a weapon for protection and then remove Don's necklace as proof of the cartel's downfall. At this time, Gus' body poison also began to attack. He forced to endure the pain to persuade the people in the house to surrender.
Ustedes no tienen a nadie más por quien pelear. Llenen sus bolsillos o váyanse en paz. O vengan a pelear conmigo y mueran.
At this point, they have to take the poison Gus back as soon as possible, otherwise Gus will be in danger of dying. As they reached the car to retreat, Mike was shot, but Jesse killed the attacker in time. Jesse placed the wounded Mike in the passenger seat and drove to Gus's pre-arranged emergency center. Jesse opened the passenger door, but the medical team, seeing it wasn't Gus, rushed to the back seat instead. The team frantically worked to save Gus, ignoring Mike's critical condition, forcing Jesse to personally help Mike. The reality was that the boss got priority over the employee. Eventually, Mike received treatment because he was valuable to Gus. Seeing Mike's blood supply depleting, the doctor instructed Jesse to get more blood from the refrigerator. Jesse discovered prepared blood bags for himself and noted how well the doctor knew his medical history. Gus had indeed planned for every contingency. Mike needed a few days to recover, so Gus decided to take Jesse back home.
You did well down here. And you also proved the point. I think you can run the lab by yourself now. Don't you?
Let Mr. White go. Pay him off or fire him. Don't kill him.
You know that won't work.
Then you got a problem.
It's clear that Gus is determined to kill Walter, leaving Jesse caught in the middle, torn between the two. Who do you think Jesse will side with? This is undoubtedly Walter's most explosive performance. To highlight the depth of human despair, he relies solely on a series of hair-raising bitter smiles to evoke empathy from countless viewers. As a result of this show, Walter has won over 40 Best Actor awards from various Hectorns. By the end, you will undoubtedly be in awe of his superb acting skills. Following the previous episode, Gus successfully annihilated the Mexican cartel with his meticulous plan, avenging his old friend. This also laid the Hectorn for establishing his powerful business empire. Due to Jesse's outstanding performance this time, Gus plans to let him manage his own lab independently. This means that Walter can be replaced at any time. Although Jesse had a quarrel with Walter before going to Mexico, he still pleaded on Walter's behalf.
Let Mr. White go. Pay him off or fire him. Don't kill him.
You know that won't work.
Then you got a problem.
It seems Gus is determined to kill Walter. Meanwhile, Walter is taking Hank to investigate Gus's chicken farm and seizing the opportunity to inquire about Hank's progress on the case. Hank also heard about the events in Mexico and meant Hector that many people seemed to have died. Walter thought Jesse was dead and could no longer hide his worried expression. Hank noticed Walter was troubled and asked with concern.
So when are we going to talk about your face?
I don't want to get into it, okay?
No, it's not okay. My brother-in-law shows up looking like Macho Camacho and he thinks we're not going to discuss it? You know, buddy, if you're in over your head on something, don't you think I might be the guy to come to?
Hank knew Walter had lost control again and tried to comfort him by using the example of an old friend. Hearing this, Walter also understood why Hank said it. Due to his fight with Jesse, Walter did not attend his son Walter Jr.'s birthday party. Afterward, Walter Jr. found Walter, and to explain his miserable state, Walter had to use his relapse as an excuse. It was obvious Walter Jr. had told Hank about Walter's secret. Walter felt a twinge of jealousy because, in Walter Jr.'s heart, he would never measure up to Hank.
But I know he got on a ride that was rough to get off of. I'm just saying I'm here, you know. I'm gonna talk about it.
I don't want to talk about it. To you or to anyone else. I'm done explaining myself.
This also revealed Walter's attitude toward Hank and his determined Hector never to turn himself in. On the other hand, Gus, having avenged his great hatred, came to Hector. Gus took out Don's necklace and told Hector that, except for him, their entire family was gone, and their only grandson was also killed by Jesse. Seeing Hector's painful expression, Gus finally felt his hatred dissipate, but it was precisely because of this hatred that it became Gus's greatest weakness. After watching this season finale, you'll understand. The next day, Walter was called by Hank again to be his driver, continuing to secretly investigate Gus's territory. Walter appeared relaxed and secretly pleased, knowing Hank wouldn't find any clues at the chicken farm. But to Walter's surprise, this time Hank wasn't going to the chicken farm but to Gus's large laundry facility. He didn't expect Hank to be so clever. Based on the lead of Gale ordering large air filter Hector equipment, Hank quickly suspected the laundry. Walter hadn't told Gus's men to prepare for such an investigation. In Desperate, Walter deliberately caused a car accident and successfully sent the still-injured Hank back to the hospital. To prevent Hank from discovering him, Walter had to go to work this way, because Walter had been serving as Hank's driver these past few days. He noticed the lab equipment still had residual heat, indicating someone had already replaced him. He urgently asked Tyrus who was working there. With a wicked smile, Tyrus mocked, "Do you think no one else can do this job besides you?" Walter immediately guessed that Jesse had returned, so he hurried to Jesse's house. Because of the last time they had a bad fight, Jesse did not want to pay a 10 hectare to Walter. Seeing Jesse's girlfriend Andrea and her child at home, Walter asked Jesse to give him the length of one song to talk. Walter asked Jesse if he was making contraband on his own. Jesse didn't deny it and even responded to Walter confidently.
Jesse, if you agree to replace me, he will kill me.
You brought your brother-in-law to our... What the heck is wrong with you?
It's not my fault, Jesse.
It's okay.
Just... You gotta help me. Please.
Last time I asked for your help, you said, I hope you end up buried in a barrel in the Mexican desert.
This was practically playing with Walter's life. Has Jesse forgotten about Gale? Walter could ruthlessly kill Gale, who was set to replace him, but he never thought of harming Jesse. As Walter turned around, he noticed Gus's men had already tracked him down. With the lesson learned from Gale, Gus would never allow Walter to harm Jesse. The next day, Walter was taken to a remote area where Gus issued him a final ultimatum.
You are done. Fired. Do not show your face at the laundry again.
Hearing this, Walter brazenly asked Gus what would happen if he couldn't comply. Gus instantly flew into a rage, furious that this old man would still be so defiant in the face of death. Walter also guesses that Jesse must be pleading for him or else Gus wouldn't have kept him around until now. Walter exposed Gus's scheme to sow discord, sarcastically noting that despite Gus exploiting Jesse's weaknesses for various gains, in the end, Jesse still wouldn't let Gus kill him. Walter had seen through it all. He was just frustrated by his inability to eliminate his powerful adversary first. Gus says Jesse will come around and accuses Walter of promising that Hank wouldn't find out about him, but Walter didn't. Now it was Gus's turn to deal with Hank.
Now it's left to me to deal with him. Can't. If you try to interfere, I will kill your wife. I will kill your son. I will kill you.
Gus says these words more harshly than he would kill Walter, and with that, he turns to leave. Tyrus untied Walter, and the group left him behind. Once Jesse was convinced, Walter's days would be numbered. A person with as many weaknesses as Jesse would likely be easily handled by Gus. Meanwhile, Saul was scolding his two most trusted men for their incompetence regarding Skyler's request to handle Ted.
He's an act of God.
Check's in the mail, at least.
Oh, hello, Mrs. White. The good news is the IRS has been paid off. The bad news is...
Just as Saul was unsure how to explain things to Skyler, Walter, who had just narrowly escaped death, suddenly burst in. Saul thought Walter had discovered Skyler's secret she had entrusted Saul to keep and was angrily coming to settle the score. It turned out to be a false alarm. Previously, Saul had meant Hector to Walter the ultimate solo Hector, disappearing and starting a new life. Faced with Gus's death threat, Walter wanted to disappear with his family.
You can't contact your friends or relatives ever again!
All right, yes, I understand.
How are you gonna sell this to that wife of yours and your teenage son?
I have got no choice.
It's gonna cost you.
How much?
The last quote I got on the deluxe was 125 grand, but you got 4 people to vanish. It's gonna be at least $500,000, and he accepts cash only.
I've got the money. Now, come on, please.
Here.
Before leaving, Walter asked Saul to call the police and report that Hank was in danger and needed protect Hector.
Please, you gotta do it for me. I'm begging you. Please. Please. My brother-in-law doesn't deserve to die because of this.
There's no way I'm mentioning Gus.
Okay.
The most I'll go, I'll say it's the cartel. They're coming back to finish the job that they botched.
You say whatever you have to say. You just give me an hour to... I need to collect my wife and kids, okay? Just give me an hour, and then you make the phone call. Don't forget, please.
In the end, Saul agreed to Walter's request, but an even more desperate situation Hector awaited Walter. When he arrived in the basement, he found that his hidden cash was gone.
What did that phone call mean?
Where is it? Where's the rest? The money, Skyler, where is the rest?
Seeing the about-to-collapse Walter, Skyler, who had secretly used the money, didn't know how to explain.
I gave it to Ted.
Gave our money to Beneke.
Saul had already hinted at this problem, as Skyler's AC Hectorns had become the final straw that broke Walter. At this moment, Walter's performance reached its peak. In Walter's most desperate moment, Marie also called for help, saying she had received police notice that Hank was in mortal danger.
The cartel, they want to kill Hank! Oh, God. They're sending agents to our house right now to guard us! God! When is this going to end?
Skyler held back her emo Hectorns and took the call, returning to the scene just shot. This was undoubtedly the ugliest moment captured of Skyler in the entire series. This was also a satire of their AC Hectorns. In their relentless pursuit of money, they ultimately hoisted themselves by their own petard. The episode's ending, driven by the actors' excellent performances and deep-seated satire, gradually pushed the plot to a climax, promising even more thrilling stories ahead. Walter is on the verge of collapse because he just learned that the money he risked his life for was secretly given by his wife to another man. The despairing Walter can't accept this cruel reality, as without that money, his family's lives would be threatened by Gus. After calming down, Walter makes a bold decision. The police have already received Saul's anonymous tip-off that someone is coming to kill Hank, so there will be 24-hour protect Hector at Hank's house. But Marie is still on edge. Walter arranges for Skyler and the kids to go to Hank's house, ostensibly to comfort the frightened Marie. But in reality, to keep them out of harm's way, Walter decides to face everything alone. Skyler disagrees with Walter facing the danger, but Walter has no other choice at this point. Before leaving, Walter calls Hank, saying he still has to run the car wash and expressing concern for Hank's safety. Walter kisses his daughter lovingly, knowing it might be his last kiss. After his wife leaves, Walter sits alone by the pool, with the gun he previously intended to use against Gus on the table. He spins the gun to see fate's will, but unfortunately, the first 2 times the barrel points at him. This signifies Walter's current perilous situation. Unwilling to accept this, he spins the gun one more time. This time, The barrel points at an orchid nearby. Walter looks at the orchid thoughtfully. This sets the stage for the rest of the episode. Meanwhile, everyone is terrified by the threat except Hank. Hank thinks it's likely that the higher-ups are displeased with his unauthorized investigation into Gus and are using this method to keep him homebound. This only makes Hank more suspicious of Gus, so he suggests Steven investigate Gus's laundry facility. Steven says he doesn't have a court-issued search warrant, but Hank argues, "What warrant? Don't we usually just go in for interviews?" Hank deliberately goads Steven, implying he's not as good in this aspect. They often bet against each other during their joint investigations. The scene shifts to Steven arriving at Gus's laundry facility for an investigation to prove he can get the job done without a search warrant. Steven uses various examples and metaphors with the employee, explaining that he just needs to take a few photos and leave quickly, hoping for cooperation. He hectors that if he did get a search warrant, he would turn the place upside down. After weighing the hectors, the employee agrees to Steven's inspection. Fortunately, Gus's underground lab is well hidden, and even with police dogs, they find nothing suspicious. Gus, watching the situation unfold on his surveillance monitors, calls Jesse in the lab and blames Walter for this severe situation. Gus's goal is to convince Jesse to let him kill Walter, but Jesse still refuses to let Gus harm Walter. After his shift, Jesse tries to contact Walter for a serious talk but can't get through. Hearing several urgent messages from Saul, Jesse rushes to Saul's office. Before meeting Saul, Huel thoroughly searches Jesse. This scene sets up a plot point for later. Saul is also planning to skip town and wants to return Jesse's money before leaving. While handing over the money, Saul tells Jesse about Walter's predicament. Jesse is shocked that Gus would move against Walter so quickly. Back home, Jesse lies on the couch, distressed, when his girlfriend Andrea calls to say her son Brock is in the ICU. Jesse rushed to the hospital and saw Andrea's worried face. Jesse could only go up to comfort him. After the doctor came out, Andrea was called to accompany Jesse could only wait outside, preparing to smoke. Jesse suddenly realizes the cigarette with ricin Walter gave him is missing. Jesse suspects Walter stole it and poisoned Brock. He rushes to tell Andrea that Brock was poisoned by ricin and advises the doctors to treat him accordingly, then hastily leaves to confront Walter. At home, Walter is extremely cahectorous, drawing all the curtains. Only after seeing it's Jesse alone does he carefully open the door. Walter tells Jesse about Gus's threats, but Jesse isn't interested in hearing it. During their conversation, Walter places his gun on a cushion and then goes to check if anyone is watching outside. Seizing the moment, Jesse grabs the gun and points it at Walter. Furious, Walter is bewildered. Jesse directly accuses Walter of poisoning Brock because Huel searched him at Saul's office. Jesse believes Walter orchestrated it. Jesse's logic seems flawless. An innocent-looking Walter denies everything, insisting he didn't harm Brock. Jesse thinks Walter is seeking revenge against him, pushing Walter to the ground in anger.
Listen to me, what would I have to gain? What possible could I, who would...
Suddenly, Walter has an epiphany. He first chuckles bitterly, then suggests it must be Gus's plan. Walter recalls Tomas's death and insists only Gus would harm a child. Walter argues that Gus's men took the cigarette to frame him and provoke Jesse into killing him. Jesse insists only they knew about the ricin. Walter counters that Gus sees everything through his cameras, knowing their every move.
If you think that I am capable of doing this, then go and put a bullet in my head and kill me right now. Do it! I'll do it!
Eventually, Jesse is convinced by Walter, determined to confront Gus. Jesse is stopped by Walter, who urges a more strategic approach. Jesse spends the night at the hospital, not returning to the lab. The next morning, Jesse is woken up by Tyrus, who reminds him to get back to work or the shipment will be scrapped, a loss no one can afford. Jesse is indifferent and says if Gus is unhappy, he should come talk to him personally instead of sending a lackey like Tyrus. Annoyed, Tyrus attempts to force Jesse, but in the public setting, he fails and reports back to Gus. This is exactly what Jesse intended. Jesse texts Walter, revealing his plan to lure Gus to the hospital, giving Walter an opportunity. Walter, at home, is preparing a remote-controlled bomb, successfully testing its detonation. To placate Jesse, Gus indeed visits the hospital, but Jesse only wants to kill him, despite Gus urging Jesse to focus on work first. Jesse remains solely concerned with Brock's condition. Jesse reveals the poisoning incident, but Gus, like Walter, reacts with a look of shock. Without spoilers, many viewers are left unsure who poisoned Brock, a mystery that will be unveiled in the finale. Realizing he can't sway Jesse, Gus reluctantly compromises.
Stay with the boy. Tyrus will dump what's there. You, when you are ready to return. Next week.
Leaving the hospital, Gus as usual caught Hector and senses something amiss. Walter, watching from across the street with binoculars, has planted the bomb on Gus's car, ready to detonate once they get in, but Gus doesn't enter the car. Instead, he surveys the surroundings. In the end, Walter's plan fails. Gus and his men leave without a hitch. Up next is the most thrilling episode of the series, featuring the ultimate showdown between Walter and Gus. The highly anticipated finale of Breaking Bad Season 4 is finally here, and it's the most exciting episode of the entire series. Although Gus has always been meticulous, he ultimately couldn't outsmart Walter. Let's watch together to see how Walter triumphs over Gus. Picking up from the previous episode, Walter successfully lures Gus to the hospital, but his plan to blow up Gus fails. After a caught Hector as Gus leaves, Walter hurriedly retrieves the bomb he had planted under the car. Walter then goes to the hospital to confront Jesse, demanding to know what exactly he had told Gus. Suspecting that Gus had caught onto their AC Hectorns, Jesse insists he didn't give anything away and even scolds Walter for bringing a bomb into the hospital. Walter asks Jesse to think carefully about other places where Gus might appear, excluding Gus's own territory since those places are heavily monitored and it's impossible to make a move. Before they can come up with a plan, Jesse is taken away by the police. It turns out that Jesse had told Andrea that Brock was poisoned with ricin, which is extremely rare and highly toxic. The doctor believes that Brock's poisoning might be related to Jesse and calls the police, leading to Jesse's arrest. Under police interrogation, Jesse explains that he exaggerated because he was overly concerned about the child's safety. He claims his knowledge of ricin comes from watching too many movies, where he subconsciously learned about it. The police find out Jesse has a criminal record, but they have no evidence linking him to Brock's poisoning. Jesse wants to leave because Walter desperately needs his help, but the police have no intent of letting him go.
Saul Goodman. That's my guy. So do I gotta call him, or do you?
The scene changes and Saul's phone rings, but Saul has gone out to hide, leaving his secretary, Francesca, to destroy the informer Hector. When she hears a knock on the door, Francesca ignores it. A loud bang startles Francesca, and she quickly grabs her pepper spray for protect Hector. When she saw it was Walter, she let her guard down.
I need Saul. I need him right now.
So you break into the place. You just break in.
I see you're here, by the way. If you'd have bothered to answer the phone or the door, maybe I wouldn't have. Forget it.
With Jesse in police custody, Saul is the only one who can help. Walter asks Francesca where Saul has gone. Francesca says that Walter and Jesse have caused a huge mess, and Saul fled to avoid getting implicated, leaving her without a job. Francesca hates Walter so much that she thinks she's going to get off work in a few minutes, but now it looks like she won't be able to leave. Seeing this, Walter offers Francesca some money, wanting to know Saul's new phone number.
Hey, look, there's got to be at least $1,700 there, okay? That'll more than cover the cost of the door now. I apologize profusely. Please, the phone number.
I bet it does. I bet you it winds up costing $20,000.
Sensing an opportunity, Francesca demands an addihectornal $5,000.
Now I'm thinking 25.
I'll be right back.
Anxious and remembering the cash stashed in his basement, Walter drives home to get the money. He doesn't drive straight to the house, fearing Gus's men might be watching. Thinking quickly, Walter calls his neighbor, pretending his family is away on a trip and asking her to check if the gas is turned off in his house. Walter uses binoculars and indeed sees two suspicious individuals. After confirming they have left, Walter quickly goes to the basement to get the money, but the two men soon return. With no other choice, Walter has to crawl out through the ventilahectorn shaft. Meanwhile, Jesse is still being interrogated by the police. Since he won't confess, they have to wait for Brock's test results to make a decision. At this moment, Walter manages to get Saul to come over.
Make like you got manners. Make like you respect the rule of law. Au revoir. Auf Wiedersehen. Hasta luego. Get the hell out. Bye-bye.
Saul advises Jesse to stay put for now, as it is relatively safe here. After a conversa Hectorn with Jesse, Saul gathers some clues and relays them to Walter. Jesse Hectorns that he recently returned from a revenge trip to Mexico with Gus. Their first stop was a nursing home to visit Hector. Walter and Jesse know Hector well, as they spent some time with him when Tuco kidnapped them. Jesse noticed the deep hatred between Gus and Hector. Jesse saw Gus gloating after killing Hector's entire family, so he curiously asked about it. Gus vaguely tells Jesse that his friend was killed by Hector. Neither Jesse nor Saul realized the importance of this clue, but Walter, driven by his strong will to survive, didn't miss it. They say the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but in this case, their Hectornship is clearly that the enemy's enemy is still the enemy. Walter goes to the nursing home where Hector resides, and Hector is furious to see his nemesis.
I know you despise me. And I know how badly you want to see me dead. But I'm willing to bet that I know a man whom you hate even more. I am offering you an opportunity for revenge.
The scene shifts to Hector ringing his bell to call the nurse. After a difficult exchange, Hector indicates that he wants to make a deal with the DEA. It's clear that Walter has convinced Hector. With the deal arranged, Walter hides outside the nursing home, waiting for the right moment. Notice that Walter has rented a white car, clearly worried about being spotted by Gus's men. With just a single shot, the show conveys the entire situa Hectorn, full of meticulous details. That's when Walter Jr. calls to urge him to come back and hide. This naturally Hectorns the scene to Hank's house. Walter Jr. is very worried about Walter, and Marie also urges him to come back quickly. Only Skyler doesn't urge Walter to come back because she knows he won't return.
Marie, he'll get here when he gets here.
I hope you just have a banner day over there. Okay, Walt? Don't worry about a thing here. Goodbye.
Meanwhile, Hank is still analyzing the photos Steven took at Gus's laundry. Just as Hank discovers something, Steven arrives. Seeing Hank still looking at those boring photos, Steven becomes a bit impatient. Hank notices that the load on the laundry's electrical panel doesn't match the equipment's power consumption Hectorn. He asks Steven to check again, but Steven Hectorns that a new witness has arrived at the SDA Hectorn and specifically requested to speak with Hank. Marie thinks it's a trap and insists Hank shouldn't go, not even to the DEA. Yet in the next moment, Hank is at the DEA office, just when everyone thinks Hector will provide important informa Hectorn. He instead starts cursing at Hank, because Hank killed his nephew Tuco. This is another form of revenge before his death. Before leaving, Hector playfully winks at Hank.
Well, at least this time he didn't shit himself. Guess that's progress.
As soon as Hector leaves the DEA office, Tyrus, who has been secretly monitoring him, reports the incident to Gus. This was precisely what Walter and Hector had planned, intending to lure Gus out. As soon as Hector returns to the nursing home, Walter, hiding in the bathroom, steps out.
Any second thoughts? Then let's get to work.
Tyrus quickly arrives as well because Hector, who never deals with the DEA, showing up there means Gus must eliminate this threat immediately. He instructs Tyrus to ensure Hector's room is secure before taking AC Hectorn. Walter, unable to leave in time, has to hide near the air-conditioned Hectorning unit. Meanwhile, the police receive Brock's test results, proving it wasn't ricin poisoning, and Jesse is released. As Jesse walks out, he brushes past a police officer. Jesse immediately contacts Andrea and plans to visit Brock at the hospital, but before he can get a taxi, Gus's men forcibly take him away. At this moment, 2 more officers appear. This also shows how desperate Gus is to get Jesse back to work, resorting to force despite the police presence all over the streets.
We just picked up Pinkman.
What about Hector?
I've checked inside and out. No wires, no camera.
All right. I'm on my way.
Maybe it's better if I do this myself.
I do this.
Gus doesn't let his men handle Hector. He wants to kill him personally to avenge Max's death. Hatred has blinded him, playing right into Walter and Hector's plan. Despite Gus's taunts, Hector remains unmoved. As Gus is about to act, Hector, who has never looked him in the eye, suddenly does, making Gus feel something is wrong. At this moment, Hector suddenly starts ringing his bell frantically, signaling to Walter. Gus, who thought he had everything under control, never realized his revenge plan was just part of someone else's. Walter becomes the ultimate winner. Soon, Walter, hiding in the parking lot, hears on the radio about the nursing home explosion that killed 3 people. The weight lifts from his shoulders, and a rare look of relief crosses his face. Meanwhile, Jesse, taken by Gus's men, is watched closely as he works like a slave. At that moment, the doorbell rings. In order to prevent Jesse from escaping, the man even thoughtfully provided him with handcuffs.
What, you got a problem with stairs?
Hearing gunshots, Jesse instinctively hides, but to his shock, it's Walter who has returned.
Gus is dead. We've got work to do.
Walter and Jesse then open all the flammable and explosive liquids, set a timed fuse, and carefully wipe their fingerprints as they leave. They trigger the alarm, urging all workers to evacuate. A raging fire ensues, destroying Gus's super lab. Afterwards, Jesse learns about Andrea's son's candy Hector, and the doctor says it wasn't ricin that hit Brock. Walter, showing concern, asks what the actual cause was. Jesse explains it was a toxin called Lily of the Valley, believing Brock ingested it by accident. This clears Gus of poisoning Brock. It's only now that we realize the significance of the shot where Walter's gun pointed at the flower. Everything was meticulously planned by Walter for his survival. He knew children were Jesse's weakness, and harming a child was the only way to get Jesse to join his plan. Despite numerous twists, Walter's plan ultimately succeeded. Walter's convincing performance when he met Jesse is truly impressive. He deceived not only Jesse but also many viewers. Watching those scenes now, knowing the truth, gives them an entirely different feel. Meanwhile, Hank's house is filled with people watching the news about the explosion in town. Skyler, looking worried, receives a call from Walter.
No, let me get somewhere where I can hear you. Tell him I'm going to go giant. Walt?
How are you doing? I'm doing quite well.
Gus Fring is dead. He was blown up along with some person from some Mexican cartel, and the DEA has no idea what to make of it. Do you know about this? I need you to.
It's over. We're safe.
Was this you?
I won.
Hearing the relaxed tone of Walter's voice, in stark contrast to his previous nervous demeanor, and considering the recent news, it's obvious even to a fool that Walter was behind it. Walter has not only become more evil but also increasingly arrogant. I can't help but think, if his acting skills are so good, why can't he continue acting in front of his wife? Finally, the director cuts to the Lily of the Valley by Walter's pool, tying back to the earlier shot, confirming that Walter was the one who poisoned Brock. Next up is the final season of the series, which is also the highest rated. If you like the show, like and follow it so you don't miss out on the AC Hector.